Instead, the way more natural thing to do is to just rest my hand on the keyboard. And you'll notice that the posture of my hand, I can basically reach all of the most important things that I want to reach just with my hand resting in this bottom left-hand corner. If you love indie tales, be sure to subscribe here and on Twitch, where I'm live most weekdays. You can also show your support through Patreon or on itch.io, where I upload assets and games shown on the channel. Hey, welcome pals to a new video. Today we are going to be covering Aseprite and how to use it, specifically how I use it. So that's pretty much all there is. Let's get straight into it. So the first question is, what is Aseprite? Aseprite is a graphics editor, a raster graphics editor specifically, that it was written for pixel art. It can be used to make all kinds of things, like this beautiful scrolling background, or your own portraits, or tile sets for your games. Literally anything that is pixel art related, you can make it here. You can even make animated GIFs to upload and share with your friends as well. The first question you're probably asking is why Aseprite, as opposed to say something like Photoshop or Microsoft Paint or anything like that. Aseprite is a dedicated piece of software that is being actively worked on all the time. There are new features releasing, routinely, and it's dedicated to pixel art, which means that it doesn't have, say in Photoshop's case, a whole lot of features that either work against pixel art or need to be disabled or get in the way of the features that you want when you're creating pixel art. So because it's so specific to this kind of medium, it gets out of the way pretty quickly and lets you just do the stuff that you want to do. Let's now talk about the workspace. So when you open up an Aseprite file for the first time, the first thing you see is this new sprite window. If you press new sprite, and here it's pretty basic. You just have your options to type in the values for the size you want. You can choose a color mode. This can be changed later. And some background options. I usually go for transparent. You don't have to worry about this pixel aspect ratio. These are basically for recreating pixel art that was on very, very old monitors that may not have had a 1-to-1 pixel aspect ratio. Some systems had, wider pixels or taller pixels, but not really relevant. So once you get past that window, you're greeted with the workspace. The workspace is really straightforward. You have your canvas. You have the toolbar on the right. This is all of the things that you use to manipulate what's on the canvas. Above the canvas is the context bar. This shows all of the options for your currently selected tool. So in this case, we have the pencil tool selected, which means that these are all the pencil options. The other thing that changes the way the pencil tool works is the palette. This is what color gets placed down when you draw and when you use it. If you're creating an RGB image, you can literally just pick whatever color you want and use that. You don't have to use the palette, but I recommend using the palette because it makes choosing colors a lot easier and is more consistent with pixel art. You can add new colors by dragging this handle. You can also copy and paste colors. You can add new colors by, if we're in indexed mode, selecting a color that you want and pressing this little exclamation mark. There's a whole bunch of ways to do it. This is the spectrum. This is where you pick the colors from, and this can be changed using the menu up here. There are some options there. You can also pick an entirely new palette from the preset menu up in the top left. So that's palettes. Below is the timeline. The timeline shows us all of our frames and layers associated with the canvas. So you can create a filled in image of one color. You can make a new layer and you can then draw on top of that layer. You can swap those around. You can make them different opacity levels. You can have different blending modes if you're familiar with what those are. There's a whole bunch of options there. And you can also, of course, animate your images by having multiple frames. That's the timeline. Above that, we have the menu, which just has more options for different aspects of the software, including things like different modes for the canvas and also extra features like the preview window, stuff like that. So that's the workspace. Let's now talk about the workflow. So the Aseprite workflow, or at least my Aseprite workflow, is one that I've developed over a long period of time. I've been using this software for over 7 years, I think, at this point. And the way that I use it, it's not the only way, but it's something that I'm most comfortable with. And I think can be attributed to why I am so fast with the tool. I know when a lot of you watch my videos, it kind of seems like I'm going really, really quickly. So I'm going to try to explain how I approach using the app so that you can make your work a lot faster and more efficiently. My process is basically the same no matter what I'm doing, although there are variations. If I'm doing an animation or a background or a tile set, they're all slightly different. The basics are I'm blocking in what I'm creating, I'm shading it, I'm coloring it, and I'm adding detail. That's pretty much the process. I work with a lot of high resolution pixel art that is, it's not quite so specific in how I place the pixels until the very last detail phase. I know a lot of people, especially beginners, like to place pixels one at a time. And this is something that I think is not a bad way to start, but the more you want to build out your work and create a high volume of work, the less feasible that is as a technique and as a workflow. So what I usually do is I stick to a very small set of tools for the most part, and I use a lot of clever keyboard shortcuts and tricks to produce a lot of work very quickly. So the first thing you want to know is how I approach using the toolbar. Basically, I never move my mouse over to here. I'm almost always using keyboard shortcuts and keeping my mouse around the canvas because it allows me to place things very quickly. So the first shortcut you want to learn is B. B is for brush. In my case, the tool is called the pencil tool, but it's easier to remember brush, right? The brush tool is super useful. You can do so much with it, but I almost always stick to using a round brush. I've got pressure sensitivity turned off, even though I'm using a tablet. Sometimes, if it works, I'll use the symmetry tool, but not always. I usually have pixel perfect turned off. And the reason for that is if I'm working and I want to draw a line, it's much more intuitive to know that every pixel that I pass through is going to be colored in, as opposed to using the pixel perfect tool, which uses an algorithm to decide which pixels you want to draw on. It can be sometimes inconsistent. For example, you just saw then, you can see the pixels and then sometimes they get removed as you move over. This is because it's designed to create single pixel brushes. So even though you touch a position, it can sometimes be erased as you continue your line across. Instead, I prefer to think of it as more like paint. So wherever I touch, that gets filled in. And then I'll go back later and tighten up the lines. That brings us to our second tool, which is the eraser. And I use the eraser mostly in the first phase, in my blocking stage. What that means is my goal is to create a silhouette, say if I'm creating a character, and I'm toggling between B and E just to define the outlines of that shape that I'm creating, right? So there's no work or effort that I have to do to think about which tool I want. I'm just going, if I want to see more pixels, I press B. If I want pixels to go away, I press E. That's about it. It's trying to take the brain work out of it, right? I'm not picking between different colors at this stage. Once I have this though, I then want to start shading. And there are two really, really special things that I do here. One is to actually switch to a different color, plot it down, and then hold Alt. This is the eyedropper tool. The eyedropper tool, if you hold Alt, it will toggle to that tool for as long as you're holding Alt. And the reason why that's so useful is you can sort of plot down some colors and then pick and choose which colors you want back and forth, right? Just by toggling between Alt and not holding Alt will give you the option to basically, just toggle between them. So I can just sample from different parts of my palette that I've created here in the canvas, just like down here. And I can actually, even up in this area, right? I can click and drag here. I can, oh, I want some of this color. Nope, I want some of this color. Maybe I'll take some of that. This sort of picking and choosing, sampling workflow is one that I use a lot when I'm doing this shading. However, there is another tool, or at least a mode, that I've been using much, much more in recent months. So this is the pencil tool up here. And here I've got simple ink selected. This is the default option. There's another option, if you ignore these middle three, called shading. What shading allows you to do is to drag a subset of your palette from, the lowest to the brightest color. You can flip this by pressing X, but by default, it's the darkest to the brightest. And wherever you draw, right, will be shifted by one value in that direction. Okay, so what you can do is, without even worrying about staying in the lines, you can just start shading what you're working on, right? And I think this is like so useful. It's a bit of an advanced technique because it involves setting a slightly different keyboard shortcut. I don't go up here every time and switch between shading and simple ink, but I switch between them a lot. So the way I do that is I have some custom keyboard shortcuts set up. You can find those in Edit Keyboard Shortcuts. And the way I have it set up is that B is the brush tool, D is simple ink when B is selected, and S is shade. So D and S toggle between the modes when I'm in the brush tool, when I'm in the pencil tool. And that's something that you can set up relatively easily. You just have to go Edit Keyboard Shortcuts and then find your way to it if you just type in shade. So here, shading is S, and that's set ink type. This only works if the pencil tool is selected, so you can set that yourself there. So during this blocking phase and early shading, I'm usually keeping the canvas about full size, right, in my view. And the way that I do that is with the Z key. That's for zoom. You can click, so right click left click goes in, right click goes out. You can also scrub, which means drag left and right. And basically, wherever you place the pen down and drag, that's the pixel that you're going to move into. So I find this really useful if I'm just trying to zero in on a specific detail. And then if I want to zero away from that detail, you just move in the opposite direction from where you want to see. If I want to see bottom left, I start from top right and I pull away. And so you can center the canvas by pulling like this, in different directions. And I do that a lot. An alternative to that is by holding space. Space is the hand tool, and you can use it to pan around the canvas. So between those two, you can get really agile. You can see me switching between magnifying glass and hand just to navigate really quickly around the canvas. That's really useful when you need to zoom in and you're working with these single pixel details and you're just trying to get around. So for the most part, those are the tools that I use. There are a fair few times where I'll use the selection tools as well. So I'll grab, the marquee tool with M, and I'll drag wherever I want to drag. Let's say I want to do some shading, but only within this region. I might do that. You can also get a lasso version of that same tool with Q, and then alternatively W will do a wand selection. So that's everything that's within the same color range. And you can make that all of the colors on the entire canvas with contiguous turned off, or just the region that you're looking at if it's turned on. And those are bound by, whether or not the pixels touch. If I was to take this and put this here, now that's all one area. So those are the selections. If I happen to have multiple layers, right? Let's just say I have a layer here with this pink thing on it and a layer here with this on it. A lot of people often ask me, how do I toggle these layers? Or even, how do I remember what's on what layer when they're not even named correctly? And the way that I do that is I press the V key, and V is our move tool, but I use it more of a layer selection tool with this button checked on, auto select layer. So if I want to work on the pink layer, I can, click it, go to the brush tool, plot something down. I can use the eyedropper, you know, plot some more stuff down. Then I'll press V, click on a different layer. And now with the eyedropper tool selected, I can click it and start working on that too. So you can move really quickly between layers that way. You can say V, Alt, click, B, click, V. I mean, I don't think like that, I just do it. But once you get used to it, it's very, very easy to just, you know, toggle between different layers and draw different things on each of them. That's how I get around, and those are the tools that I use for the most part. So I want to show you how I get around in Aseprite when I'm doing the work that I do. Basically, I have my tablet here. I don't use the mouse, although I have the mouse and I can do pixel art with it. I generally don't like to be drawing with it because I just find it a little bit cumbersome to be using my elbow the way that I do. Instead, when I'm drawing, I really like to use the pen, and so I use that the majority of the time. What I don't do is use any of these keys here, these express keys or whatever they're called. I just ignore them because they're not in a very intuitive place for me to put my hand, right? There's nowhere I can rest my hand to give me quick access to any of these buttons. Instead, the way more natural thing to do is to just rest my hand on the keyboard. And you'll notice that the posture of my hand, I can basically reach all of the most important things that I want to reach just with my hand resting in this bottom left-hand corner. So if I want to drag around, that's space, very easy. If I want to zoom, that's my ring finger goes to Z and I can drag left and right. I can press Control if I want to change some sort of modifier. I can press B to go to my brush tool. I can press E to erase. It's all right here, right? And if I'm doing things between two layers, so, you know, let's say we've got another layer here, I can just give you a little demonstration. So clicking this, G for paint, for the paint bucket tool, I can select this button here to get a color. Maybe I'm doing a cool question mark or something like that, right? So let's just shape this, erasing there, picking the color here, going back to the V to make sure I'm on this layer, B for brush, and that's just kind of how it works. That's basically that's the approach. I'm just whizzing about here, pressing the keys that I need to press. I'm not going all the way over here. I'm not going over here. I'm not moving my hand back and forth between the tablet and the mouse because all of that is just too much effort. And it's also like the reason why I don't move my mouse over here and click the toolbars themselves, the toolbar tools. I literally want to keep my mouse, my hand here. I mean, look how fixed this brush hand is. I can reach either side of the canvas and my wrist doesn't have to leave the table. So for me, this is like, this range here is where my eyes are and where my hand reaches the entire time that I'm drawing. Even if I'm drawing something as big as this. I just want to say one thing. I do use a kind of like a plugin, like a tool that somebody wrote for me to change the brush size. So this D and scrubbing across, this is something that I've been requesting is added to Aseprite as an official feature. But as of right now, it's just something that I can do. You can basically replicate that by dragging this. It's the same thing, but it's just one more thing that I don't have to reach. And the way I'm doing it right now is I've got this little Java applet called AceBrush, made by a friend of mine, Wispy, and it just says when I'm selecting the D key and I'm dragging left and right, treat it like I'm scrolling with the control key with the mouse. Because I'm not holding the mouse, I can't do this. I don't have any way of scrolling with this, and I sure as hell don't want to be moving my hand all the way down here and trying to dial this to make it bigger. So that's my little shortcut here of how I change the brush size. And that's so handy for me if I'm trying to, you know, work with something and then make something a little bit bigger, go a bit smaller. I do that all the time. So I hope it gets added soon because it's really useful to me. So that's my workflow. That's how I plot pixels down. I want to tell you about a couple of other features that Aseprite has, just to keep your interest. Okay, so there are a bunch of little things that I've come across when using Aseprite that you might stumble into and not know what's going on, or you might not know about and find useful. The first is tab. So tab disables or hides the timeline. There's another way of doing this that you might do accidentally and get stuck and not know what's going on. If you press Control F, you can hide different parts of the UI. And I think the first time you do this, you'll get some sort of window saying, hey, did you mean to do this? Basically, it lets you full screen the entire canvas. And if you know how to, if you're in the shortcuts and you know how to use them the way I do, you can use the app fairly comfortably, still doing this. As long as you don't need the palette itself, you can eyedrop the colors that you want and just work this way. It's good for viewing things at full screen, or if you're trying to just like show something off to somebody in like a Zoom call or whatever, and you don't want the UI in there. That's how you do that. You can press Control F and it just cycles through different variations. And then tab gets rid of this. That's disabling parts of the UI. Another thing that tends to happen to me quite a lot is snapping. If you press Shift S, what will happen is the work that you're doing will snap to the grid, right? All the lines you draw, everything will snap to the grid. And the first time this happened to me, I was like, what is going on? I don't know how to get out of this. There is a little thing that says disable snap to grid in the bottom right to make that go away. Another little feature that I think a lot of you appreciate a lot more than I appreciate it, because I don't use it that often, is the preview window. So the preview window, what is it? It's just a version of the canvas that you can put in a window. I think in the next version of Aseprite, this is going to be able to be pulled away from the actual Aseprite window. So right now it's locked within Aseprite, but soon I think it will be its own window that you can drag around your desktop onto your second monitor or whatever you want to do. So you can actually even play animations here. And if you want to do that with the keyboard shortcut, it's Shift Enter will play and pause animations in this space here. So that's the preview. One that I use a lot for work like this is this huge canvas here, right? It's a repeating background. It's actually a lot smaller than it looks. I use tiled mode to basically duplicate the canvas. So you can go tiled mode in one axis, in this case, X axis. And what this does is just duplicates the view of your canvas twice. So anything that you do gets transferred across all three. They're not three different canvases, and it doesn't extend your canvas. All it's doing is duplicating what's shown in this window twice. If you did want to make your canvas bigger, you can go into the sprite option, select canvas size, and you can drag it that way. Now, another really handy feature that I think makes Aseprite basically the best, one of the best pieces of software I've ever used, is something that allowed me to make this image right here. There's a lot of detail here. It's a very complicated looking thing. It looks like it's all rotating and doing so in 3D space. And I created this partly with the help of basically this design pattern that appears in Aseprite. So in Aseprite, if you have something selected and that selection appears as part of a set, you can perform operations across the entire set. Say, if I have my palette and I want to make an adjustment to the brightness, if I select multiple palette indices, I can change the brightness across all of them at the same time. Okay, that's really cool. If I have a color or a selection that appears across multiple frames, I can change that selection by, say, replacing the color, and that will work across all of them too. If I don't do that, if I have one frame selected and I change the color, it'll only appear on that frame. So you can make group changes to anything in Aseprite that is part of a selection. And this also works with the marquee tool as well. So if I select a portion of the canvas, but then select multiple frames, right? I can replace a color within that selection across all the frames, right? So I could take this, create a selection, drag the layers that I want, select here, replace the color, and now it's replaced everywhere, even if they're not the same contents, right? So we could draw, something that looks like this on this frame, on this frame, on this frame, on this frame. We could draw all kinds of different shapes, and then select the window, select every frame that we want it to apply on, replace the color, and that will play out across all of those now. So powerful. And it doesn't have to be all on the same layer either. You can make this change over things across different layers as long as you select them. Right? I could select this and 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 do something specific with those frames too. The other thing that's really handy is you can just drag things across layers if you want. You can swap layers, you can move an entire frame back if you want, or you can move a frame forward. Aseprite's way of handling moving these objects is a little tricky. Once you've clicked it, you'll see there's a red fill with a yellow border. You have to grab the yellow border to make this work. Dragging the red fill will just change your selection. So instead you want to click and then run to the edge of that rectangle, and now you can drag it around. So I've shown you replacing colors with Shift R, but let's now cover outlines with Shift O. The outline tool is such an easy tool to use and replaces a lot of boring work by simply just clicking a color, dragging the color that you want. You can choose inner or outer, and you can choose how dense you want the outline to be. And that's it. Easy peasy. I believe you can also do this over multiple layers and multiple frames. There it is. So if you have, say, an animation and you want that animation to be outlined, you can do that just as easily. So I've shown you the workspace, I've shown you my workflow and some tips and tricks on some hidden features that you might not know about. The last obvious thing that I can show you is export options. So let's say you've been working on your pixel art thing for multiple hours now, and you're finally happy with it this time for sure, and you want to export it somewhere. You want to share it on Twitter or put it in your game or whatever it is. So there are two ways to export your work. The first is with the export option, which is right here, export. You can do that by pressing Ctrl-Alt-Shift-S as well on the keyboard. This option is pretty straightforward. You can pick a folder, you change the name to whatever you want. You can resize it. This is especially useful if you're uploading to somewhere on the web like Discord or Twitter. Often what will happen is if you keep this at 100 and your work is pretty small, say 16 by 16, it's going to show up in a very tiny little window wherever you send it. And if it doesn't show up as a tiny little window, it'll be scaled up with what's called a bilinear filtering. So it'll become really blurry. If you're exporting your work and you're getting blurry results, changing this to be much higher is definitely going to help you out. So if you're working with like 16 by 16, you want to go to like 6 or 7 or 800. If you're working with something like 64 by 64, you only need to increase it by like 200 or 400%. So in this case, 64 by 64 is what I want. If you're exporting assets for your games, do not change this, okay? Your game should be able to scale the graphics in the engine. You don't want to scale them when you're exporting your artwork. This is only for sharing on the internet. Then you have layers and frames. So this is on what basis you want to export this, right? Are we exporting the visible layers on this frame or just the selected layers, a specific layer, and then which frames do you want to export? So this window is for exporting a single image or an animated image, right? But it only shows one frame's worth of content in the window when you export it. So you can export it as a PNG of just your work, or if it's animated, you can export it with this window as well as a GIF. And that will figure itself out. If you've got multiple frames selected, it'll figure that out. You can select from here the file format that you want, and if you select GIF, it'll animate if you've got multiple frames. GIF is the only format of this list that actually can be animated on the web. You can export an animation as PNG files, but what that will do is export every sprite, every frame, as its own PNG that's just numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. If instead what you want is a sprite sheet, so one sheet that has all of the frames on it for use in your game, rather than pressing Ctrl-Alt-Shift-S, you just want to press Ctrl-E. This is the export sprite sheet option. You have all these options, and the first one is just what you actually want the sprite sheet to be indexed as. You know, is it a horizontal strip? Is it a vertical strip? Is it a box of rows and columns? You can define that here pretty easily by rows, you know, number of columns, 3 columns, and this will be, you know, 3 columns split into rows left to right, right? Again, like the previous window, we have this layers and frames options. So you can export just one tag or one frame or whatever it is that you want to export based on the selection here. You can add some padding. I don't usually have these, but you can do them for sure. And then the output file. So that's been my rundown of Aseprite. If there's anything specific that you want me to talk about regarding Aseprite that's not in my existing playlist, we've got, I think, about 50 videos now on this channel. So the odds are that I've covered pretty much everything that Aseprite has at this point across one video or another. But if I haven't, and there's something that you really like, then definitely suggest it in the comments below, and I'll take a look at it and see if I can answer there. Otherwise, I might even make a video about it. So let me know what you want to see next, and I'll cover that in the next video. Thanks for watching, pals. See you in the next one. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice. Thanks again, and until next time.